and is the author of 3 New York Times best-selling books on the Bush administration's executive power and foreign policy abuses. Greenwald was named by The Atlantic as one of the 25 most influential political commentators in the nation. He is the recipient of the first annual I.F. Stone Award for Independent Journalism, and is the winner of the 2010 Online Journalism Association Award for his investigative work on the arrest and oppressive detention of Bradley Manning. You know, during the Bush-Cheney years, Glen would criticize the Bush administration and attack them for their assaults on civil liberties, and the left absolutely loved Mr. Greenwald. Now that there's a Democratic president doing it in office, he attacks the same president for the same abuses, even worse abuses, and many of his liberal friends aren't so happy with him all the time. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Glen Greenwald.
Good evening, and thanks very much for coming out tonight. As Jacob said, this is the second part, the sort of sequel of our Civil Liberties tour. We did one 6 months or so ago on the East Coast and in the Midwest, and what we found was that the most vibrant and constructive part of the evening tended to be the question and answer session that followed our speaking. So we're all making very diligent efforts to confine ourselves to a much shorter time period than we're accustomed to speaking, in order to leave as much time as possible for a Q&A session. And as a result, I'm going to just try and rush into the sort of core issues that I think are most important to consider when we talk about civil liberties in the United States, what I really think is kind of the crux of the matter. And to do that, I think the first thing that it's really worth doing is to look at the title that we've given to this event, which is Civil Liberties Tour, and to begin by asking what is it that we even mean when the word civil liberties, the term civil liberties, is used, because it's often the case that in our political discourse, lots of terms get tossed around with great regularity, and many of those terms are very ill-defined. We don't think very much about what exactly it is that we even mean by the terms that we use. And so I think it's really worth taking a minute to even ask, what is this term civil liberties? What does it denote? And the reason why I think that's a valuable exercise, and not a very difficult exercise ultimately, is because the term civil liberties is really not that complex of a concept. It's actually really quite simple. What it really means is the list of limitations that we've imposed on what the government can do to us in its exercise of power. We've essentially told the government we're willing to recognize the legitimacy and validity of your power, provided that there are certain lines that you never cross. And the really good thing about thinking about that concept is that this list is not very difficult to find. It's not hidden. You don't have to have a scavenger hunt to go and find it. It's actually all contained in one place, in one document, called the Constitution or the Bill of Rights. And the other very good thing about this list, this concept, is that these limitations that we've imposed on the government are very clear and absolute in their prohibitions, in their mandates. So there's not very much ambiguity or complexity to it. There's not a lot of debate really needed or warranted to understand what they are. They're extremely both clear and absolute. So if you look at the First Amendment, it says, Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. If you look at the Fourth Amendment, it says there shall be no unreasonable searches and seizures of our houses, our papers, or our homes without probable cause warrants, search warrants issued upon finding a probable cause. If you look at the Fifth Amendment, it says that no person shall have life or liberty or property deprived without due process of law. These are extraordinarily extreme terms by their very nature. I remember I had this really acrimonious exchange a few years ago with Joe Klein, who's a writer for Time magazine. I actually had a bunch of acrimonious exchanges with him, but one in particular that I'm thinking about took place, I think, in like 2007 or 2008, and I don't remember exactly what the argument was about, but it was very confrontational, very acrimonious. And in the middle of the sort of 2-week-long exchange that we had, he wrote this column and was responding to something that I wrote, and in the middle of it he sort of said something like, well, in any event, Glen Greenwald is a civil liberties extremist. And I was reading this, and I got to that sentence, and I honestly, this is truly my reaction, I read that, I was really all of a sudden kind of baffled, because I was thinking, here we're having this extremely vituperative exchange, calling each other all sorts of names, and yet all of a sudden, in the middle of it, he decided to pay me this really nice compliment, calling me a civil liberties extremist. Why did he suddenly get so nice and decide to lavish me with that praise?
And then it took me a minute, and I realized, no, actually, you know what is really strange? I think he means that as an insult. Like, civil liberties extremist, that's a bad thing for him to be. And the reason why it was so baffling to me is because that, to me, is the greatest compliment someone can pay me, because it's really a term that is the only way to believe in civil liberties is to be extremist about it, because, as I said, the prohibitions that we've imposed on the government are absolute in their nature. And by that, what I mean is that we don't disallow the government or prohibit the government from crossing these lines in certain circumstances. We haven't said to the government, you're permitted to abridge free speech or to deprive liberty or life without due process in these circumstances. You're only to adhere to those prohibitions under certain conditions. That's not what we said. We said you are never to violate these lines or transgress these limitations, no matter what the justification, no matter how compelling you think the circumstances are, no matter how aggressively you argue that doing so is necessary for our public welfare or for our own safety. And you see that value embedded in all sorts of ways in the Constitution, both as it was created originally and as we've always understood it. So if you look, for example, at the Fourth Amendment, which most people are familiar with, that bars searches and seizures without a search warrant, it's a fairly amazing decision that those who wrote the Constitution and then those who ratified it made, because telling the state and its law enforcement agents and police that you cannot enter our homes unless you first can demonstrate to a court that there's probable cause to think that we've done something illegal is a pretty risky commitment to make, because if you were to allow the police to simply enter whatever homes they want at will whenever they want to, that would probably be a lot better for law enforcement. If there were a rapist on the loose, or a mass murderer, or a child molester, or someone committing all kinds of horrible crimes, or a terrorist, the police would have a much better chance of catching that person if they could just invade whatever homes they want, search through whatever they want at will. But the decision was made that there are more important things than that level of safety, than empowering the police to catch criminals or to protect the community from people who are menacing it. The decision was made that the values of privacy, of being able to limit state power, were of such supreme importance that we were demanding that it be adhered to, even if it meant sacrificing some degree of our own public safety.